Okay, let's unpack this because there's this really weird thing that happens in business and tech. You get these companies, right? Super smart, really well managed. They're leaders in their field, loads of cash, brilliant people.
The best of the best, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet, when some new technology comes along, something that really shifts the landscape, they often just stumble badly. Sometimes they even fail completely.
Yeah, it's kind of baffling when you first look at it.
It feels totally wrong, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, good management is supposed to help you handle change, avoid crashing and burning.
Right. That's the expectation.
But what if, and this is the twist, what if the very things that make a company successful, the things they're good at, are exactly what cause them to miss the next big wave?
That is absolutely the core puzzle. You know, they get so optimized for one way of doing things, one reality. And when that reality changes, their strengths suddenly become weaknesses. Liabilities, really. Exactly. Liabilities. And that's the mystery we're really going to dig into today. We've got a stack of fascinating sources here that tackle this exact problem.
Yeah, some really classic work.
They look at how innovation works, drawing lessons from, well, maybe unexpected places, like the disk drive industry, super competitive back in the day.
Oh, yeah, cutthroat.
And steel mills, heavy industry, even the early days of electric cars.
Really diverse examples.
So our goal with this deep dive is basically to give you a shortcut to understanding this. It's a critical challenge, especially if you're someone who's, passionate about shaping the future of tech.
Or maybe thinking about starting something new yourself.
Right. Or if you just love asking those contrarian questions, challenging the way things are normally done. Yeah. So what's hiding in these pages? What are the surprising bits? Let's jump in.
I think understanding why the giants often stumble, it's almost like finding a map, a map to where the real opportunities might be for people ready to shake things up. Okay, so let's frame it up. What's the fundamental question these sources are wrestling with? What's the core problem they're trying to solve?
Well, at its heart, it's this. Why did these really competent, often dominant companies, with all the advantages you could think of, why did they falter or even fail when they faced certain kinds of technological change?
Okay, so not all change, but specific types.
Exactly. And the really big idea, the sort of counterintuitive argument they make, is that it wasn't because of bad management. It wasn't incompetence. It was actually because the decisions they made, decisions that were perfectly logical, totally rational, the right decisions, frankly, for their existing business, those decisions ended up setting them up for failure when the context shifted because of a new kind of technology.
Wow. So doing the right thing led them down the wrong path. Their competence kind of blinded them.
In a way, yes. That's a powerful way to put it. And to really get our heads around this, the sources make this really crucial distinction. They talk about two different types of innovation.
Okay, what are they?
Right, so they separate things into sustaining technologies and disruptive technologies.
Sustaining and disruptive, got it.
Sustaining innovations are basically improvements. They make existing products better along the lines that current customers already value. More speed, higher quality, more features, that kind of thing. These can be small, like little incremental tweaks, or they can be huge, really difficult, radical breakthroughs. But the key thing is, they keep the company moving along that established path, the performance trajectory the market already expects and understands.
And the sources say that big established companies are usually great at this stuff.
Oh, absolutely fantastic. They've got the R&D departments, the deep customer relationships, the manufacturing scale. They rarely fail because they can't keep up with sustaining innovations, even the really tough ones.
Right, they're built for that game. So what about the other kind, disruptive?
Okay, so disruptive technologies. This is where it gets really interesting, where the paradox comes in. These innovations, when they first appear, actually result in worse performance if you measure them by the traditional yardsticks.
Worse? How so?
Well, they might have less capacity, or be slower, or have fewer features than the established products that the mainstream customers want.
Yeah, they must bring something else.
Exactly. They bring a different kind of value. They're typically simpler, often a lot cheaper, maybe smaller, or more convenient in some new way.
Okay.
And crucially, they usually find their first customers in niche markets or completely new markets. Customers who value those different things, customers the big players might not even really be focused on.
And these seemingly lesser technologies are the ones that cause the big incumbents to trip up.
Ironically, yes, they're the ones that often lead to the downfall of the market leaders. They might look clunky or underpowered at first, maybe even like toys.
Yeah.
But they have this hidden potential to completely redraw the map of the industry.
Okay, let's make this real. Give us some classic examples from the sources. Sustaining first.
Okay, sustaining. Think about disk drives, which the sources cover a lot. Later generations of the read-write heads, things like thin film heads or magnetoresistive heads, they were huge breakthroughs, technically difficult, but they were sustaining because they just dramatically increased storage density. More megabytes per platter kept things moving on the expected path.
Right, more of what the existing customers wanted.
Exactly. Or moving from those old removable disk packs to the sealed Winchester drive architecture. Again, improved performance, reliability, still playing the same game, just better.
Yeah.
In steel, if you take a big integrated steel mill and you spend a fortune modernizing it to make higher quality sheet steel more efficiently for, say, car bodies, that's sustaining innovation for that kind of company.
Makes sense. Okay, now the disruptive examples.
Right, so the big one in disk drives was the move to smaller physical sizes, from those washing machine size 14-inch drives down to 8-inch, then 5.25-inch, then 3.5-inch.
The ones that went into PCs eventually.
Exactly. Initially, those smaller drives had way less storage capacity and were slower than the big mainframe drives.
So worse performance by the old metrics.
Totally. But they were smaller, lighter, used less power, and were cheaper. And that made them perfect for completely new applications like mini computers, word processors, and then, boom, personal computers. A whole new market the big drives couldn't serve.
And the PC itself was disruptive to mainframes.
Absolutely. Or think about retail. Discount stores like Walmart versus traditional department stores like Sears was disruptive. Less fancy service, maybe not the same perceived quality initially,
right,
but way lower prices and a different kind of convenience. That disrupted the old model. Steel minimills are another classic. They started making cheap, low-quality rebar out of scrap muzzle.
Stuff the big mills didn't want to bother with.
It's exactly low-margin stuff. But the minimills built a totally different cost structure that allowed them to make money doing it. Then they gradually moved up market. And electric vehicles today, you could argue they fit the pattern. Early ones, less range, maybe slower acceleration compared to gas cars by mainstream standards. But they offer other things. Simplicity, potentially lower running costs, charging at home, a different value proposition that appeals to certain users or use cases, like city driving.
Okay, so I get the difference. Sustaining fits the current model. Leaders nail it. Disruptive doesn't fit. Looks inferior at first, and that's the problem. But why? If you're a well-run company, surely you have people looking out for these things. How do you miss something so potentially huge?
Yeah, that's the crux of it. And this is where the sources offer their main argument. They basically say that the very management practices that make you good at succeeding with sustaining innovation in your existing market, those same practices actively prevent you from succeeding with disruptive innovation.
Whoa. So doing everything by the book actually leads you astray here.
Pretty much. It's a management paradox. And they break down why this happens into a few key principles.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first one is about resource dependence. It's pretty simple, really. Companies depend on their customers and investors for resources.
Makes sense. Money orders.
Right. So naturally, they listen really closely to their most important, most powerful customers, the ones driving today's revenue and profits.
The big accounts.
Exactly. And what are those big mainstream customers asking for? They're asking for improvements in the sustaining technologies. They want the next generation of the current product, just better, faster, cheaper, whatever.
More capacity, better performance along the lines they already care about.
Precisely. Now, disruptive technologies, they usually start out serving small, maybe kind of weird emerging markets with different needs. Those markets don't have the loud voice of the big established customers. So when it comes time for the company to decide where to put its money, its best engineers, its R&D budget,
it naturally flows to where the current big customers are asking for stuff.
Yeah, the pull from the existing powerful customer base is just overwhelming. Disruptive ideas that don't serve those customers, they don't get prioritized.
So even if someone inside sees the disruptive tech, the system itself is just wired to say, nope, our key customers don't need that yet.
Exactly, which ties right into the second principle. Small markets don't solve the growth needs of large companies. Disruptive innovations, almost by definition, start small. The initial market might be tiny, maybe even hard to measure using traditional methods.
Right.
Now, if you're a huge corporation, say, a multi-billion-dollar company, you need to find massive new sources of revenue just to keep growing at the rate your shareholders expect.
Yeah, you need hundreds of millions or billions in new sales.
Exactly. So along comes this disruptive technology, and its total market size right now is maybe, what, $10 million? $20 million.
Pocket change for the big company.
Right. It looks completely insignificant. It's not worth the management attention, the overhead, the distraction from chasing the much larger known opportunities in their existing markets. It just doesn't move the needle.
So it gets dismissed as just a niche thing, a distraction, not the potential seed of a future giant.
Yep. And that's directly related to the third principle, which is a big one. The ultimate uses or applications for disruptive technologies are fundamentally unknowable in advance.
Unknowable, really?
Well, think about it. Good management traditionally relies heavily on market research, careful planning, financial projections.
Spreadsheets, forecasts.
Exactly. You try to quantify the market size, predict growth, calculate the ROI. And that works pretty well for sustaining innovations because the market is known, the customer needs are understood, the trajectory is somewhat predictable.
Okay.
But with disruptive tech, the market often doesn't really exist yet, or it ends up evolving in totally unexpected ways. How do you forecast that?
Yeah, you can't really, if you ask your current customers, they'll probably say, no thanks, because it doesn't meet their current needs.
Exactly. Standard market research is useless, or even worse, it's actively misleading. It tells you there's no market, or the market is tiny.
So what's the alternative? Just guess.
Well, the sources suggest a different approach. They call it discovery-based planning. Basically, you start with the assumption that your initial forecasts are probably wrong.
Okay.
So your plan isn't about hitting specific forecast numbers. Your plan is designed to learn as quickly and cheaply as possible. You iterate, you experiment, you adapt based on what you find.
More like exploring than executing a fixed map.
Exactly. And alongside that, they talk about agnostic marketing, which means you accept that nobody, not you, not the engineers, not even the first people who buy it, really knows for sure how this new disruptive thing is going to be used or what the killer app will be. So you watch closely how people actually use it in the real world. You experiment with different applications, different markets. Remember that Honda motorcycle story they mentioned?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Well, Honda came to the U.S. trying to sell their larger bikes to serious motorcycle enthusiasts, competing with Harley and Triumph. But they struggled. Meanwhile, their little 50cc Super Cub, which they were almost using just for their own staff to run errands, people started seeing them and wanting them for just like casual cruising around town running errands. It wasn't the market they planned for at all. But they saw it happening, leaned into it, and boom, they created a massive new market segment. They learned by watching and adapting.
That takes a totally different mindset, doesn't it? Less about control and prediction, more about flexibility and learning.
It really does. A different organizational metabolism, as you said earlier. Which brings us neatly to the fourth principle. Organizational capabilities can become disabilities.
Okay, this sounds deep. Capabilities become disabilities.
Yeah, this one's maybe the most profound. A company's capabilities, what it's good at, aren't just about the smart people it hires. They're baked into its processes and its values.
Processes and values, explain.
Yep. Processes are, the way work actually gets done, how products get developed, how things get manufactured, how sales happen, how budgets get allocated. They're the routines, the systems.
Right. The how.
And values are the criteria the company uses to make decisions. What kinds of profit margins are acceptable? How big does a market opportunity need to be before we pursue it? How important is satisfying our largest customers versus exploring something new?
Okay, the why behind the decisions.
Exactly. Now, these processes and values, they get built up and refined over years, often decades, and they make the company incredibly effective within its specific value network.
Okay, hang on. Define value network again. What exactly is that?
Right. A value network is basically the whole context a company operates in. It includes its suppliers, its customers, its partners, and it's defined by a specific way of ranking what's important in a product. What attributes customers in that network value most. And it also has a typical cost structure associated with it, what it costs to compete and be profitable in that specific network.
Give me an example.
Okay, back to disk drives. The mainframe computer value network placed a huge premium on raw storage capacity, speed, and absolute reliability. Customers there are willing to pay high prices for those things, so companies could operate with high gross margins, maybe 50, 60%.
All right, high performance, high price.
Right. But then came the personal computer value network. What did those customers value most? Well, small physical size was critical, ruggedness, low power consumption, and definitely a much lower price point. Margins in that network were much thinner, maybe down around 15, 20%.
Totally different priorities, different economics.
Completely different. So now imagine your company whose entire set of processes, how you design drives, how you manufacture them, how you sell them, and whose values like needing 50% gross margins to be considered a good business are all tuned perfectly for that high-end mainframe network.
Yeah.
How easy is it for that same organization, using those same processes and values, to suddenly pivot and start making cheap, physically tiny, low-margin drives for a completely different set of customers who care about different things?
Probably incredibly difficult, almost impossible maybe.
Exactly. The very processes and values that made you successful in Network A become disabilities when you try to compete in Network B. The sources emphasize how hard it is for one organizational unit to effectively juggle two fundamentally different sets of processes and values at the same time. An opportunity that looks amazing through the lens of Network B, low margin, small size, looks completely unattractive, maybe even financially impossible, through the high margin lens of Network A.
Wow. Okay, that really clarifies the pattern of failure then. So the established companies, they can often develop the disruptive technology itself, like build a prototype.
Yeah, absolutely. They usually have the engineering talent, the labs, the resources. Getting a working prototype of the disruptive thing often isn't the main hurdle for them. The tech itself isn't usually the killer.
But then their internal systems kick in. The resource allocation process, the budget meetings, all driven by the needs of the current big customers and the financial rules of their established value network.
Yep. Those systems reliably, almost automatically, starve or kill off the disruptive projects. They just don't meet the established criteria for investment. They don't fit the mold. They don't promise the right kind of returns for the right kind of customers.
Because that's the opening for the new guys, right? The startups, maybe spin-offs.
Exactly. That's their moment. These new entrants, they embrace the disruptive technology precisely because of its current attributes. Maybe it's cheaper or simpler or smaller. They don't see those as flaws. They see them as features for a different kind of customer. And they go out and find, or sometimes create from scratch, a new market that actually values those specific attributes. And critically, they build their whole company, their cost structure, their sales process, everything tailored specifically to that new market and the economics of the disruptive tech.
And then the disruptive tech starts getting better, often faster than the old tech.
Yes, that's a key part of the pattern. Disruptive technologies often improve along those traditional performance lines, like capacity or speed, at a much steeper rate than the established sustaining technologies. Right.
So eventually, that initially inferior tech gets good enough to start meeting the needs of the mainstream market. It starts invading the established players' turf.
And that's when the big companies finally wake up and try to react.
Usually, yeah. They scramble to adopt the disruptive technology to try and defend their existing customer base.
But by
then, it's often too late. The entrants have had a crucial head start. They've built years of experience designing for this new paradigm. They've optimized their costs. They've built relationships and brand recognition in the new value network that's now starting to conquer the old one. The sources basically say the established firms end up trying to fight a war on terrain where the attackers already hold all the high ground.
And that old advice, stay close to your customers, which sounds so right.
It leads you straight off a cliff when dealing with disruption, because your best mainstream customers are the very last people who will want the disruptive technology in its early, inferior form. Listening only to them guarantees you'll miss it. Okay, this is sobering stuff. But the sources must offer some hope, right? For people who want to actually succeed with disruptive stuff, what's the playbook? What are the counterintuitive lessons?
Yes, absolutely. They look at the firms that did manage to succeed, often the entrants, but sometimes established firms that handled it differently, and they pull out some principles.
Let's hear them.
Okay, first, you need to embed the disruptive project within an organization whose customers actually need it, even if that customer base is small or totally new right now.
To find the right home for it.
Exactly. Often, this means creating a separate organizational entity, like a spin-out company or a truly autonomous division or an independent venture unit. Think of Quantum creating its hard card business as a spin-out. Or IBM setting up totally separate divisions for things like the PC, which targeted a different market than its mainframes. Or even Walmart initially building its online business as a separate entity from its physical stores. The point is, you need to shield it from the mainstream organization and connect it directly to the customers who do value it. This harnesses that resource dependence principle for the disruptive effort, not against it.
Got it. So don't try to cram it into the main business where it doesn't fit. What's next?
Second, put the disruptive project in an organization that's small enough to get genuinely excited about small opportunities and small wins.
Ah, back to the small markets idea.
Right. A startup or a small independent unit inside a big company isn't burdened by needing to find billions in revenue right away. A project that brings in, say, $5 or $10 million in its first couple of years can be seen as a huge success and attract further investment and talent within that smaller context. It aligns the scale of the organization with the scale of the initial disruptive market.
Okay, that makes sense. Turn the smallness into an advantage. Principle 3.
Principle 3. Plan to fail early, often, and cheaply while you're searching for the market. Basically, ditch the traditional, rigid, forecast-driven planning process.
The one that demands all the answers up front.
Exactly. Instead, embrace that discovery-based planning we talked about. Assume your initial hypotheses about the market, the product, the business model are probably wrong. Design your plan around running experiments, gathering data, learning quickly, and iterating. Failure isn't a disaster, it's data. It's learning what doesn't work so you can find what does.
So it's much more about exploration and adaptation than hitting fixed targets.
Precisely. Okay, principle 4. This one's crucial. Leverage the mainstream organization's resources, things like money, talent, maybe basic technology, but crucially, not its established processes and values.
Use the assets, but not the operating system.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You need to create fundamentally different ways of working, different decision criteria that are tailored specifically to the disruptive opportunity. This often requires that separate organizational structure, again, maybe a dedicated heavyweight project team operating outside the normal rules, or that independent business unit. You can't just force a disruptive business model into the existing corporate machinery. They give the example of Compaq trying to add direct sales, a disruptive channel for them, into its existing structure built entirely around resellers. It didn't work. The existing processes and values rejected it.
So tap the mothership for fuel and parts, but build a completely different kind of engine for the disruptive venture.
That's the essence of it. And finally, principle 5. Go find or develop new markets that actually value the disruptive technology's current attributes. Don't just sit around waiting for the tech to get good enough for your existing mainstream customers.
Find someone who loves it now, warts and all.
Exactly. Stop focusing only on its limitations compared to the old tech. Find the customers for whom being cheaper, or simpler, or smaller, or more convenient right now is the winning feature. Frame the core challenge as a marketing one, finding or creating the right market niche, not purely a technological one of just improving the specs. Think about Kano peripherals, specifically targeting the emerging portable computer market for their small, rugged 3.5-inch drives. Or Nucor, finding that initial market for its lower quality minimal steel in concrete reinforcing bars, rebar, where top quality wasn't the main concern. It's about seeing the technology for what it is today and finding the people who see value in that.
That completely flips the usual script, doesn't it? It's about finding the market that fits the product you have now, not just trying to force your product into the market you already know.
It really does. It's a market-finding challenge, first and foremost.
And speaking of timing and finding markets,
yeah,
the sources also talk about when it's important to be a leader versus maybe being a follower, right?
Yeah, they do. And it's different for the two types of innovation. For sustaining technologies, the evidence they present suggests that being the absolute first mover, the leader, often isn't essential.
Really? Even for big breakthroughs?
Apparently not always. Followers can often watch the pioneers, learn from their mistakes, and then use their existing market power, manufacturing scale, and customer relationships to catch up and often do just as well, if not better. There wasn't strong evidence that being the first to adopt, say, a radical new sustaining technology like thin film heads gave you a permanent, insurmountable advantage.
Interesting. But for disruptive technologies?
Here the story changes. For disruptive tech, the sources argue strongly that leadership does matter. They show data indicating significant first-mover advantages.
How so?
Firms that entered emerging markets defined as being less than 2 years old with disruptive technologies, had a much, much higher success rate in terms of eventually building a really substantial business, like hitting $100 million in revenue or more. Getting into that new value network early, whether you were a startup or a spin-off from an established firm, seems to have been really critical.
So for disruption, getting there early counts.
It seems to confer a real advantage in establishing position, learning the market, and building the right capabilities before incumbents can react effectively.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together. The big picture here is this really powerful paradox. The very same management systems, the processes, the values that make companies brilliant leaders in their existing markets, mastering that sustaining innovation game.
Yeah.
Those are the exact things that create blind spots and become major handicaps when a disruptive innovation comes along. So the good managers, the ones playing by the established rules and doing everything right according to that playbook, are often the ones who get completely blindsided.
It's a profound challenge to a lot of conventional business wisdom, isn't it? And, if you're listening to this and you're passionate about technology's future, maybe you want to build something new, or you like challenging norms. Understanding these dynamics feels absolutely essential.
Yeah, it really changes how you look at things. It means you have to question what looks like good management or common sense inside established organizations.
Right.
It means being willing to look at technologies that currently seem, underpowered, maybe unprofitable, kind of niche, and ask different questions.
Like, who else might value this? What completely new market could this enable or serve, even if it looks tiny right now?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the next huge opportunity might start out looking completely insignificant or even flawed if you're only looking through the lens of today's dominant market.
And it suggests that succeeding with real disruption often requires a fundamentally different approach. Maybe building a different kind of organization, operating with different rules, different measures of success, at least initially. It's about spotting and navigating those emerging, often hidden value networks.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored that central paradox of why good companies fail. We've unpacked the crucial difference between sustaining and disruptive tech. And we've looked at those counterintuitive principles for actually succeeding when disruption hits.
And the sources don't just give answers. They leave us with some really great, thought-provoking questions to chew on.
Like what?
Well, one is there actually a market somewhere for all new technologies? Probably not, right? So if you're a manager, how do you even begin to figure out which nascent technologies are worth pursuing aggressively and which ones you should probably just shelve? That's a tough call.
Yeah, the huge judgment call. And what else?
Well, just hammering home that core dilemma again. One source basically summarizes it as the primary thesis is that the management practices that allow companies to be leaders in mainstream markets are the same practices that cause them to miss the opportunities offered by disruptive technologies. In other words, it concludes, well-managed companies fail.
Wow, just lays it out there. Well-managed companies fail.
It really forces you to reconsider what well-managed even means, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The definition seems to change depending on the type of innovation you're facing. The logic is different.
Okay, so here's a challenge for you listening, especially if you are passionate about tech innovation or maybe part of a community trying to spark new ideas. Start looking around at the technologies emerging today.
Yeah, the stuff that's maybe a bit weird, a bit clunky.
The ones that seem niche, maybe they're underperforming by current standards, maybe they're struggling to find a clear business model right now. Ask yourself, is this just a better version of something old, sustaining, or could it be something fundamentally different, disruptive?
And then push further. Who are the potential new customers? Maybe people or groups that established players aren't really paying attention to, who might actually value the current, perhaps weaker attributes of that potentially disruptive tech, who might love it because it's simple or cheap or different.
And maybe the biggest question, if you had the chance to champion one of these disruptive ideas, knowing everything we've just talked about, how would you set things up differently? How would you build your team? What rules would you operate by? How would you structure things specifically to navigate the challenges and seize the opportunities of disruption? avoiding the traps that snare so many established players.
Yeah, the sources don't give you a simple recipe, but they offer a really powerful lens, a different way of seeing the landscape and asking much better, much sharper questions.
Keep asking those questions. Keep digging.